Hi guys, it's Debbie, and it's finally that time of the month in which we get to look back at everything I watched this month. And as always, I love to hear what you guys have been watching, what you enjoyed, what you would recommend. You let me know everything because I also take a lot of inspiration from what you watch. Now, as there are quite a few titles on today's list, I thought I'd start from the ones I enjoyed the most. And I apologise if I go through everything quite quickly, but there is a lot of content to cover. The first film I would absolutely recommend is A Prayer Before Dawn, the real story of a British guy who was arrested in Thailand and who ended up incarcerated in a Thai prison. Now, already your average prison environment isn't exactly cosy, but the living conditions of the prison in which he stayed were particularly awful. And in addition to those circumstances, he basically didn't speak the language, and as he was the only foreigner, he really stood out, something you definitely want to avoid in prison. He was suffering from the effects of drug addiction, he was threatened by prison gangs, he witnessed awful events, and the whole situation was then all lost in translation. This feeling of being lost was conveyed in the movie by there not being any subtitles when the Thai language was spoken, except for when there were very important plot elements by which we wouldn't be able to understand the rest of the film. So it's a very chaotic situation. The acting is nerve-wracking, the camera leads you into scenes you don't really want to see. It's definitely recommended. Another great film I watched was actually a much older one, and one which is ultimately a classic piece of cinema, and that is Dog Day Afternoon, with a very young Al Pacino as the protagonist. This is one of those films which make you think, now that's good acting, because the setting is so limited and the concept so basic that it relies mostly on compelling acting, which in this film turned out to be really natural and therefore believable. The plot is based on the true story of a famous bank robbery led by Al Pacino's character. As in many heists, things then get out of control, the situation escalates, and things get out of hand. And then as the plot moves on, we learn about the characters, understand what their intentions are, what led them to those circumstances. But it's not set on the background of a huge heist situation, like, I don't know, Baby Driver, Triple Frontier, Inside Man, these huge films with different settings, different environments, storylines overlapping. The environment depicted in Dog Day Afternoon is a bank, which could be your average office, the policemen waiting outside, and the crowds looking on at the scene. That's it. So the film really relies on the actors' performances, which turned out to be really nuanced and realistic. And the film ended up actually with 5 Oscar nominations and 7 nominations for the Golden Globes. Then I watched, or to better say rewatched, because I've seen this film countless times, Goodfellas. In my opinion, Goodfellas sits alongside The Godfather, the first film, as one of the best gangster/organised crime films of all time. This film has always been showered with appraisal, and I would personally recommend it because it really set a baseline for all the modern gangster films that came after it, as well as it being referenced in numerous films of various genres. It's a classic Scorsese film, so you've got the Italian-American cultural background, the group of gangsters and their lives, both within and outside their criminal activities. In this case, it's the real story of a mobster portrayed by Ray Liotta from his childhood all the way to his later years, his associations, his work, his relationships, and of course his friendships, in particular with 2 guys portrayed by Joe Pesci and Robert De Niro. You can see where the baseline for the modern gangster film culture was created. In reality already with previous films, but this movie is often picked as a modern symbol of the genre. The only thing that I wanted to point out is that I read that apparently a lot of people are offended by this film because it depicts Italian culture as only being mob related. Dunque io sono italiana e non so assolutamente da dove vengano queste voci, perché in verità qua in Italia nessuno si è mai lamentato di questo film, perché semplicemente sappiamo di non essere tutti mafiosi. Quindi in verità non so da dove provengono queste voci. Now I need to take a moment to speak about Netflix, because my dear friend Netflix has skipped from producing loud, trashy, cheap content to potentially being at this year's Oscars, because recently it has been releasing some very good films. The first one is The Devil All the Time, which is a creepy, bleak story set in 60s rural America. Now, the unifying theme of this movie, without getting into spoilers, is faith. And all the characters have somehow been affected by the concept of faith or the concept of sinning. And I can't say too much because of spoilers, but let's just say it gets darker and darker as the story unfolds. I wouldn't describe it as a horror movie, it's more of a dark psychological thriller, which then hits you hard when you least expect it. It has a huge cast. It's got Robert Pattinson, Tom Holland, Jason Clarke, Mia Wasikowska, there's Bill Skarsgård, who else is on it? Sebastian Stan. There are so many. The other good Netflix film, which I really enjoyed and which is very, very, very different, is I'm Thinking of Ending Things. Now, if you watch this film, prepare yourself for your brain to be fried, because many elements in this film don't make sense, or to better say, they're very symbolic, they're very metaphorical. It's the story of a young couple who travel outside the city in a heavy snowstorm to visit the in-laws, the boyfriend's parents. They're both pretty educated people, so during the trip, they have these lengthy discussions which involve all sorts of topics, from niche book references to criticism about classical music theatre. They share their philosophical thoughts, and it just keeps on piling on. And in addition to that, when they reach the parents' house, the in-laws' house, everything becomes even weirder. There is a lot more that doesn't really add up, and it's actually way more extensive than what you see just in the trailer. It's very hard to understand it and explain it even after watching the movie, so imagine introducing it trying to avoid all the spoilers. My tip is definitely go watch it, as well as The Devil All the Time. Another Netflix film, which instead I wasn't expecting it to be as good as it turned out to be, was a recent Korean film called #Alive, or just Alive. At first glance, this just looks like your average exaggerated zombie splatter movie, the one you watch just for the excitement and fun induced by the bad effects, by the ketchup blood, and you know what I mean. But in reality, the nature of the story is one we can kind of relate to after going through the lockdown this year, and that is the concept of loneliness, depression, hopelessness, and our desire for human contact. Yes, there is something that transforms these people into zombies, but which then aren't even that particularly curated. They're just white makeup, fake blood coming out of the mouth zombies. The actual story is that of the guy who ends up locked, isolated in his apartment, trying to stay away from these zombies and trying to figure out a solution to all of this. I would definitely recommend this film if you're looking for something different from what is usually offered within that genre. Now instead, I need to talk about a documentary, because I absolutely love this documentary to the point that I watched it twice this month. I've been recommended to everybody around me, and I think it should be seen by anybody who spends any amount of time on the internet, so basically all of us. And in my personal opinion, I think this documentary should be shown in schools. This documentary is called The Social Dilemma, in which many founders or tech experts who worked on the creation or enhancement of social media platforms, research engines, tell you exactly what's going on behind your life online. And although now I know you're thinking, oh, I don't need that documentary, I already know everything about what goes behind my life online. These documentaries are just for parents who think their kids are having too much screen time, or for older people who don't know that that ad for dog food came up on Facebook because they've been Googling dog food for the last 2 weeks. No, this documentary is for everybody, especially for us who use so much time on the phone, who have such high screen times. Those of us who close Instagram, look at the phone and just open it up again. It really explains all the details, all the psychological thinking that went into the details of these platforms, and how it has catastrophic effects on society. You have to watch it to understand, trust me. Okay, now isn't there anything trashy to talk about, just to change the subject a little bit? There is the it list. This is so awful, I'm going to just quickly speak about it and then we're done. Let's just peel the plaster off. Basically, this film is a sort of Ferris Bueller meets American Pie, but all made for this new YouTube prank Jake Paul generation. It's the story of a rude, spoilt high school kid who's fed up of his posh regular life and who decides to start living outside the box, and who shares a list of all the things he wished he could have done, which then affects many other kids in town and all around the world. That's it. There's nothing more that I could say about this film that would make you want to watch it, that could recommend it. That's it. It's not even a fun teenage film that you watch. No, it's just painful. Then instead, a great film I watched is Clich, an A24 film which hardly anybody ever speaks about, but which just completely blew me away. Just as with Dog Day Afternoon, Clich also presents a very limited setting, but which works incredibly well with great acting. Krisha is the name of the protagonist, a woman who has messed up a lot in her life. She hasn't kept up with her family, she's often let everybody close to her down, she's gone through addiction, which didn't help things, and she's basically being cut out of the family, until one day she returns home for the holidays and has to face the consequences of all the time lost. It's all set within the rooms of just one house, but with a very powerful and emotional delivery. Another A24 film I watched was Native Son, with a plot which proves you can never ever trust an A24 film, in a positive sense. I can't believe how each and every other film is so different, and I know that by now there is the recurring meme of A24 films only featuring the same 4 white actors with an indie background, hipster music and a retro Tumblr look. But in reality, every plot is so different and refreshing, with interesting and distinctive topics and an intriguing aesthetic. There is always something that will make an A24 film stand out. For example, this film, Native Son, opens up in a manner which is nearly too normal. It's quite boring actually. But then at one point, your jaw drops and it's not going up until the end of the film. I can't say too much because of spoilers, and I would highly recommend not watching the trailer. It doesn't give too much away, but at the same time it already brings your mind in a certain direction. I can just say that the protagonist is a punk kid who ends up working as a driver/assistant for a very fancy posh family where the main events unfold. I'll leave it at that, just don't watch the trailer. Then moving on to a completely different genre, I decided to rewatch a film I always go to when I'm looking for something frivolous, something just to get my mind off of things, something a bit trashy, let's say it, and it's The In-Betweeners. How to explain this? If you've never seen the film or the series on which it is based, it's basically all laugh out loud comedy. It's ridiculous, it's rude and a little offensive, but all in a good-natured, funny way. The characters are a group of British teens who are still trying to figure everything out, especially from the point of view of relationships and sex, and who are just trying to actually accomplish anything. In this film in particular, they decide to go on a holiday abroad and everything is a disaster. Do not expect this film or the series to be like Skins, Shameless, Euphoria. Forget about it. This is poop jokes, 2000s music and cringeworthy interactions. And that's why it's funny. I then watched Paddleton, a film which had repeatedly been popping up as recommended after I'd watched, how to say this, I had watched a lot of comedy films, but which were clever, irreverent, but also quite depressing. I don't know if that makes sense, but take, for example, the comedy of The In-Betweeners and imagine the complete opposite. Paddleton is the story of 2 best friends, one of whom is diagnosed with terminal cancer. So they decide to make the time left as least depressing as possible. They go on a long journey together and they end up exploring some very deep aspects of friendship, but with a ton of dark irony. I would have never ever expected this film to hit so hard in the feels. I just expected it to be a little sad, and that's all. It's tough, but it's a good movie. I actually watched another film with a similar mood, a little less depressing, but it was a slow, melancholic comedy which kind of makes you sad, but also kind of inspires you, and that is Heartbeats Loud. Now in this film, we are introduced to a guy who is an absolute music lover. He works at a record store. His dream is of being in a band, and he makes some music with his daughter just as a hobby. Until one day he realizes that he could make so much more out of this passion. And so here begins all the deep questioning about one's life and ambitions and setting aside dreams for more realistic necessities. This isn't an award winner, but it gets you grinning at the gloominess of life. Then I watched 2 animated films, Coraline and Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs 2. Now because Coraline is such a famous film, over the course of time I'd kind of seen all the most famous scenes and I knew where everything was heading, but still it was so creepy, even knowing everything that happened, even having already seen most of the scenes. This is not Nightmare Before Christmas creepy, this is characters sewing buttons into their eyes creepy. Coraline is the story of a kid who lives in a very depressing household in which everything is grey and boring, including her parents, but she discovers a hidden world in which everything appears to be perfect for her, including the behaviour of her so-called other parents she finds there. This, of course, until everything looks like a living nightmare. Coraline is a very popular animated film. You will find it recommended on many lists, and if you think the creepiness factor won't affect you, you might want to try it anyway. Instead, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs is a very different kind of animated film. I've always loved the first film, so of course I was very curious to watch the sequel. Now, as the title hints, these films have to do both with food and weather. As a matter of fact, the protagonist is a crazy scientist who, after a series of misadventures, creates a machine that provides food from the sky. Of course, at first that's a blessing until the situation gets out of hand. So we go from cute burgers and days off school because it's snowing ice cream to giant, murderous rotisserie chickens. The sequel isn't as good as the first film. It sort of just flows on for the first chapter, but without adding anything particularly new. So I wouldn't really recommend it, but at the same time, after you've watched the first film, you want to know more about the world. So for now, I'd just recommend watching the first movie and then you see what floats your boat. Next on the list, we have Willem Dafoe in a creepy movie called Animorph, which I never heard of, but which I randomly stumbled across on Amazon Prime Video. I think this film aimed at something on the lines of Hannibal, so a deep insight, a creepy insight really, into the monstrous mind of serial killers. And for it being a very little known film, it actually didn't do too bad. Of course, it's nothing close to films like Red Dragon or Seven, but it still had some pretty chilling scenes. Dafoe portrays a detective investigating a string of murders while also having to deal with his own personal issues. So for being a smaller, independent, very little known film, it actually didn't go too terribly wrong. For example, I tried another wannabe creepy film, this time from the 90s, called Single White Female. Now, if you've ever been suspicious about your flatmate, this isn't the film for you. Because it's the story of a woman who goes through a very bad breakup and she finds herself a new flatmate. But this new friend is basically the creepiest stalker person you would want in your house, and the story degenerates from there. This fits perfectly in that 90s cheap, creepy horror thriller genre. It's nothing exceptional, but it might be a good idea for Halloween. Instead, a film which I am sure has been a big Halloween pick for many years is Silent Hill, which I had never seen before, but which was the big horror film growing up. Everybody talked about it, everybody had it on DVD. If you had seen it, you were basically a grown-up. And as I was saying, this is a great horror film to watch together with your friends, especially at Halloween. And I must say that that scary aesthetic really stuck even 15 years later. Briefly summed up, Silent Hill is the name of a mysterious ghost town a woman visits with her daughter, who would always mention it in her sleep. Of course, it's a terrible idea, and the town is infested by a series of monstrous-looking creatures, frightening characters, and everything your worst nightmare could include. Enjoy. Then, because I was working on a couple of commissioned Gerard Butler videos, I decided to watch one of his films I had never seen, and that is Geostorm. Now, apparently I hadn't been missing out on anything by not watching it. It's a wannabe Armageddon, but more on the Sharknado end of the spectrum. In Geostorm, our climate is controlled by a satellite system which prevents environmental disasters until it stops working. So our Gerard has to go up in space and save planet Earth from up there. I don't know really what else to say about this film. I would rather recommend watching films like The Day After Tomorrow if you're looking for a end of the world because of the environment kind of film. Or you can just look out the window if you want to see an end of the world because of the environment situation, if we want to get more realistic. But anyway, next up I watched Case 39, which instead tried to create a ominous film about weird families and creepy characters and the weirdness of faith. It basically had the goal objective of creating something like the devil all the time. And I must admit, the first part of the film was pretty creepy. There were some elements which I was definitely not expecting, but that didn't justify the overall aspect of the film, which I wouldn't really recommend. The title, Case 39, refers to a new case a social worker is assigned to, so a family in which the parents and their daughter are just not getting on. There are visible signs of serious trauma, and the social worker is trying to put together all the pieces of the puzzle until the much larger truth is revealed. Again, it did have some scary moments, but in my opinion, not enough to make the whole film a good horror pick. There's so many other interesting ones out there. Even on today's list, there were quite a lot of horrors. For example, there actually is a horror film I would really recommend, which is Creep. This film is absolutely terrifying, but it basically could have even been filmed on your phone. The person who makes it really creepy is the protagonist. Basically, it's the story of a guy who pays a cameraman to follow him around and make a sort of day in my life video for his son who is about to be born. All of this because he is diagnosed with a terminal illness and he wants to leave his son something that will show him how he would have been, basically, in just his regular daily life. But when the camera turns up at his house to film, things just get worse and worse and worse. I'm not going to say much more, just trust me, watch this. Following up is The Captive, about the mysterious disappearance of a kid one day when her father leaves her unattended in his car for a while. The father is portrayed by Ryan Reynolds. Unfortunately, I can't remember any of the names of the other actors in this film because it wasn't particularly memorable. Basically, the film is this. She is kidnapped. Reynolds' character feels guilty, him and the wife never give up, they go out on a hunt to look for the kidnapper, but while also being investigating themselves, some new clues appear. Long story short, if you really want to watch something in this genre, even without it necessarily having the same plot, you should watch Prisoners. You'll thank me later. Then a good mysterious film I watched this month was one I had been meaning to catch up with for a very long time, and that is Memories of Murder by Bong Joon-ho, the director of many famous films, including the recent Oscar winner, Parasite. What I found over the course of time is that his films never really stick to one specific genre, and even with the darkest circumstances, they still include a lot of irony. For example, here the topic is that of a serial killer at loose, and it's dark and gripping and creepy, but at the same time it includes the trope of the funny, goofy police department attempted to find the culprit. I don't know how else to describe that mix of genres, but I've seen it happen over and over again in his films, and it makes them so much more interesting to watch. Another good film I watched was Circle, not to be confused with The Circle, starring Emma Watson and Tom Hanks, which is easily avoidable. Circle is probably the film on this list with the lowest budget, but still with a very interesting plot. It simply introduces us to a group of people who wake up in a room with a set of lights and circles on the floor, and every time the lights turn on, a person dies. It's as simple as that, so the group has to quickly figure out what's going on, figure a way out, figure basically how to survive this game. It's a psychological torture, and they also have to deal with the differences within the group. They're not suddenly all cooperative. I found out this film is inspired by 12 Angry Men, a movie I've never seen but which is often recommended, so I guess it's time to catch up. Then I watched another popular film I'd never seen, and that is Secret Window, starring Johnny Depp. Now this is based on a work by Stephen King, the master of horror, so you always know you're in for a treat when his name appears on the credits. In this movie, Johnny Depp portrays a writer who begins to receive unwanted attention by a stalker who claims to be another writer who wrote some material the protagonist allegedly copied. At first he's just introduced as a grumbly guy, but as the plot moves on, more and more is revealed. Well, as I said, it is a Stephen King story. Another stalker kind of film I watched this month is Unforgettable, in which a woman just can't get over her divorce. And when her husband gets serious with his new girlfriend, she tries to do anything possible, literally anything possible, to keep her place as the important woman in his life. The new girl also has issues of her own. She has a violent boyfriend she's escaping from. It all sounds very interesting, but trust me, it isn't. Then towards the end of the month, I saw a film I hadn't really planned on watching, but it was so advertised and so spoken about that eventually curiosity caught up with me and I ended up watching it, and that is Inola Holmes, as in Sherlock Holmes' sister. And after all of that, I actually ended up watching it twice because also my family wanted to watch it one night. This film wasn't terrible, but it could have done so much better. When I rewatched the second time, I noticed a lot of small or even big details which could have been improved. This film is targeted at a young audience. It's clean, it has that fun, adventurous action, chases on trains, coming up with ingenious plans. It has interesting Sherlockian riddles and clues, and Millie Bobby Brown was very likeable. She would often break the fourth wall in a very fun way. All of this just for the first half of the film. The second half, first of all, felt like just 2 hours of a film on its own. It just felt like a completely different movie. In the end, most people ended up enjoying it, so I will leave the final verdict to you. Next up, I watched Spike Lee's Da 5 Bloods because I was making a video about the 2021 Oscars, for which many are saying this could be a potential nominee. I will leave that linked if you want to watch that video about the Oscars. Da 5 Bloods features a group of Vietnam War veterans who returned to Vietnam many years later, as they left a lot of unfinished business over there. So they returned there to pick up from where they had left, and we also get an interesting insight into their personalities. And this film has a really engaging look. It shifts between different styles, it has a good soundtrack, the acting wasn't bad, but there was something missing for me. And the annoying thing is that I really can't put my finger on it. If you have any ideas on the topic, please share them with me, because I really can't unravel my thoughts about this movie, and I'd love to do that before the Oscars actually come around. We're coming up to the very last titles now. The next one is The Whole Truth, starring Keanu Reeves as a lawyer defending a kid in what looks like the worst case for him. He is tried in court for having murdered his father, and he has basically nothing to support his case. It's a very interesting courtroom thriller. Watching this film, you basically sit with a jury and have to make up your mind on the matter, while all the various pieces of information are brought forward. It's a pretty low-key film. I'd honestly never heard about it. I think the only time I'd ever associated Keanu Reeves with a lawyer could have been with The Devil's Advocate. Another film I watched towards the end of the month was The Rite, a horror film starring Anthony Hopkins as an exorcist. This film isn't anything more than your average exorcism story, but at least it has some good acting and it's well put together. Sometimes these stories tend to have people climbing up walls and screaming, and the rest is just pea soup being sprayed across the room. Instead, one of the aspects I enjoyed the most here was the discussion on whether God and Satan actually exist, how exorcism can be explained by science, the concept of faith in good rather than the faith in God, all of that. And now we have reached the last film on today's list, and that is Dreamhouse, starring Daniel Craig, Rachel Weisz and Naomi Watts. This is actually a really interesting film. I definitely wasn't expecting it to evolve the way it did. I admit that the ending was absolutely awful, and the film would have been better off without basically the last 20 minutes. But the main portion was really good. Briefly summed up, your perfect family moves into a new huge house and everything looks perfect, until of course they start hearing noises and seeing things and odd events happen. And that's when the film kicks in the gears and goes down a path none of us were expecting. But with that, we have reached the end of today's list. If you're still watching, thank you so much for sticking around right until the end. Now I would love to hear what you thought about all these films, what you've been watching, what you liked, what you didn't like, what you'd recommend. Let me know everything, let us know everything with a comment right below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you soon in the next one. Bye.